Axe murders were fairly common in the 19th century and is now, believe it or not. A murderer could easily enter a home and chop the inhabitants to bits without disturbing or waking the neighbors. The axe was a silent and deadly instrument of death, and sadly enough, many axe murders were never solved. Unlike murder by gun, an axe murder was generally gruesome. Chunks of flesh and brain would scatter the floor. The victim often did not die right away and was sometimes hacked multiple times before death overcame him. Some say the axe, every axe is cursed, meant to take a human life. Before we begin, do you have an axe? Perhaps a friend or the little old lady down the road. The Mudgee tragedy. No one could believe it. Why would a retired police constable, living in Mudgee, New South Wales, murder his wife and infant child? At first, when the news broke out, some newspapers were inclined to believe there was a mistake. It had to be a lie, but it wasn't. In September 1898, John McCoy snapped, grabbed an axe, and battered the brains out of his wife and child. Neighbors knew that the marriage was tense and that McCoy was often very cruel to his wife. Mrs. McCoy had often hinted that she was afraid John would one day murder her, but no one stepped in to help because they did not believe McCoy would go so far. On the morning of the murder, screams were heard coming from their home. A young man ran over and witnessed McCoy strike his wife with an axe. The man took off and ran to the police station. The police arrived to a grisly scene. There were pools of blood, clots of brains, and the murdered bodies of the woman and child. The infant had her head chopped open from the back. The wife had been hacked with the axe multiple times. The back of her head was split open, and her brains were on the floor. McCoy was caught trying to clean himself off with a bucket of water, and his 3 sons were safely nearby. At the inquest, McCoy claimed that his late wife was the abuser, despite witnesses claiming that he was the aggressor in the relationship. He refused to pay for the internment of his wife and infant daughter. At trial, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to be hanged. Wisconsin has had its fair share of axe murders. In Grand Rapids City, Wisconsin, many got quite a shock in the spring of 1858, when the body of a butchered woman was found inside a shanty. The scene was gruesome, and the shanty was covered in the woman's blood. According to one report, the woman's head is literally chopped to pieces. The murderer gloated over his victim and mangled the lifeless corpse, after he had murdered her. The blood-coated axe was found near the body. As is often the case, the woman's husband was immediately suspected and taken into custody after being discovered near the shanty. Patrick Bennett admitted to butchering his wife. He had a previous criminal record for robbery and was known to be a drunk. What happened to Patrick Bennett after his arrest is not known. However, around that time they believed do unto others as they do unto you, so he may have met an axe as well. Another case brings us to a man named Samuel H. Morris. He had managed to make a bit of extra money working in New Zealand, and with it, he and his wife moved to Blacktown. They bought a small homestead and eventually hired a worker, Hing Lung. Everything went as it should until one day in 1888, Lung received 2 visitors. Morris didn't like the appearance of the visitors and ordered them off of his property. Instead of complying with the owner's wishes, Lung ignored Morris and had the visitors return to the hut where he lived. Some time later, Lung received a mysterious letter. After reading it, Lung appeared to be upset, but nothing more was said of the matter. The wife then sent her husband to fetch some water, and while he was stooping down, Lung struck Morris over the head with a piece of wood. A struggle ensued, and Lung grabbed an axe. Morris grabbed a garden hoe. Lung gave Morris 2 hard blows to the head with the axe, and Morris returned a blow to Lung's head. Morris, amazingly still alive, ran toward the house, calling for his wife. She stepped out and was attacked by Lung, who broke 3 of her ribs with the axe. She escaped and ran to the neighbor's house, over a half a mile away. By the time the neighbors got to the homestead, Morris was dead from an axe wound that cut through his head. Leung was caught crawling back to his hut. At his inquest, Leung claimed that the fight was over wages that Morris owed him. The wife, however, stated that there were no wages due and that she believed they were attacked for other reasons. Leung was found guilty of willful murder but died from his wounds before he could go to trial for sentencing. It was rumored that they had found gold or some type of treasure. As it turned out, his wife the widow lived a very nice life after the event. This was one right out of a creepypasta. Leroy Rogers had been an old bachelor living on a small farm in Michigan when his body was found in 1894. It was a horrible scene. Leroy's skull had been crushed in above one of his eyes with the flat end of an axe, and the blade of the axe was still embedded in the man's neck. The body was still warm when it was discovered by a neighbor, so the murder was fresh, but there was no solid clue as to who could have done it. All that was known was that there had been a tall man spotted near the house sometime before the murder was committed. The only motive the police could come up with was robbery. Leroy's gun and watch were missing. He was not known to have had much else in the way of money. The tall man was said to move with the shadows and alongside the house. The idea of a shadow-wielding axe man raises the hairs on the back of my neck a little. Another case of a mysterious axe man. In 1845, we have an odd story of an old man and a young girl, probably aged 14 or 15, who rented a house in Parramatta. The neighbors were naturally suspicious about the circumstances concerning the young girl, whom the old man passed off as his daughter. They believed they were a couple and that the young girl had somehow been seduced by the man. However they came into each other's lives is not the story, though. It was how the couple ended that filled the newspapers of the day. A few days had passed, and the neighbors saw no movement coming from the rented house. Out of curiosity, some of them went inside. They found nothing on the first floor, so they went upstairs. There, in the corner of a room, they found a bunch of old clothes on the floor and a blanket being used as a makeshift bed. On top of this, they found the mutilated body of the young girl but no blood. The blood and gore was found in another rented home in Sydney. In that place, there were pools of blood on the floor, and the walls were covered in red. In an apparent axe mark in the wall, there were traces of the girl's hair. It was obvious that the old man had murdered the girl in one place and carried her to the other. According to a doctor who examined the body of the young girl, she had multiple head wounds, and her forehead and cheeks were covered with bruises. She had bite marks on her chin, her ears were injured, and one of her fingers was cut off. Bruises on her torso revealed that she may have been brutally kicked multiple times. The old man was identified as possibly being named Halloran or O'Halloran. He had disappeared after the murder, and no report was found about his capture. Would you pick up a hitchhiker with an axe? In the old days, horse and wagons it was a very common thing. Clay Young met Bush and Cooey at a wagon yard in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in 1899. They told him that they were on their way to Arkansas, and Clay asked if he could join them on their trip. The men were fine with having another traveler join them, and they left, crossed the Arkansas River, and traveled by wagon for several more miles before stopping for the night. As the three men bedded down in the wagon, Clay began to think over his situation. He realized that it would be easy for him to kill the other two men and take everything they had, including the horses and wagon. Clay decided that murder would be an excellent plan, and while the other two men slept, he grabbed a gun and an axe. He whacked Cooey on the head with the axe. As Bush woke up, Clay gave him a blow to the head. To finish off the job, Clay put the gun to Bush's neck and pulled the trigger. At this point, Cooey began to regain consciousness. Clay raised the axe again, and this time he crushed the man's skull as if it were an eggshell. Bush, who had already endured a blow to the head and a gunshot wound through the neck, was still alive, so Clay finished him off with the axe. Unfortunately for Clay, the men had very little money on them. Clay was quickly captured after the bodies were found, and he confessed, without remorse, to what had happened that night. He was given a life sentence. Sometimes they hear voices. James P. Davis of Maine had spent some time in the state insane asylum for being of unsound mind, but he was discharged as cured and returned home to his parents. On a spring morning in 1874, his mother went out into the yard and saw her son standing over the body of his father, holding a bloody axe in his hands. The top of the father's head had been chopped off. The mother spoke to her son and convinced him to put away the axe. She then led him into the house and told him to wait there while she got the neighbors. The neighbors came and took the troubled young man into custody. When questioned why he killed his father, Davis said, "Washington ordered me to do it." The moral of this story: if he has an axe, just say no. And stay paranoid, my friends.